This is the Worldly Wellbeing podcast. I'm Holly.
And I'm Luke.
And through the conversations we're having on this podcast, we're seeking to connect with what worldly wellbeing means. And by listening today, you're joining with us.
Today, we are really excited to introduce Oscar Boyd to the Worldly Wellbeing podcast listeners. Oscar is a journalist and podcaster in Tokyo, Japan, and I'm really excited to have a chat with him. I should be at this time right now in Japan, but given the current context, that's not going to happen.
I mean, to be honest, Luke, it's the next best thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, let's dive right in.
Let's go.
Well, hi there, Oscar.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on today.
Hello, Oscar. Thanks for coming along.
It's really great that you've been able to join us for the Worldly Wellbeing podcast today. We are talking to you live in Tokyo in Japan, with some confusing time differences thrown in for good measure, and potentially some stormy weather over there as well. So it's all very exciting for us here today. But for those who don't know you, Oscar, maybe you could say hello and who you are and what you do.
Yeah, it's going to be a very, very exciting podcast recording, I think. So my name is Oscar, and I live, here in Tokyo, Japan, Japan's finest, biggest capital city. And I normally run a podcast for the Japan Times, which is Japan's oldest and largest English newspaper out here. And the podcast is called Deep Dive. It's kind of a current affairs show. So every week we look at kind of what's happening in Japan and how that's kind of affecting life for people living here. A lot of it, as you might expect, has focused on coronavirus recently. But, every now and then we get to throw in a more exciting episode, like taking my colleague up to the top of Mount Fuji, something like that, which is, always good fun.
It's a podcast that I started listening to last year. I think lots of people got into podcasts in a variety of different ways last year because it was like, oh, this is something to listen to. This is something
including
yeah,
and even
absolutely.
making them as well.
Yeah. Our story is that's when we kind of sat down together and realized that we might want to talk about, well, just talk to each other really to begin with and record it for people to listen to. But I started listening to Deep Dive last year when I started to begin to learn very rudimentarily Japanese and trying to just kind of plug in to like the culture and what's going on in Japan. And I remember that episode that you actually just spoke about the climbing to Mount Fuji. I remember being really jealous about it because we were in the midst of really quite tight restrictions here. And although the wind was rattling and there was rain, and I think it was one where you were with your friend who was potentially struggling a little bit to begin with. Even that sounded
very diplomatic.
I was sat there going, oh gosh, like he's outside and I'm not.
Yeah, well, so I mean, the story behind that one, actually, we did actually make it I think it was 6 months before the pandemic really struck. So it was like long before anything like that was really on anyone's minds. But yeah, the story behind that one was I have a bit of a weird obsession with Mount Fuji. I've done it 8 times and I've tried to do it different ways every time. So, the kind of normal climb for sunrise, the climbing it to go skiing down it, which is also amazing. And then that time I'd tried to do a sea to summit with some friends, and we'd cycled up to the start of the path, walked to the top and then skied down all together. I got back from that trip and my colleague said, God, how did you do that? I've never even climbed a single mountain, and that basically germinated the idea of this podcast, where I said, well, if you've never climbed any mountains, why don't we make your first proper climb Mount Fuji, and we can record it all for the podcast and see how it goes. And part of the fun was, as you so diplomatically put it, that he was struggling for a lot of it, which made for a really good episode, and went through all the different elements and luckily got to the top for not for sunrise, but for a beautiful rainbow appearing out of the crater. So yeah, it was kind of like it was very good for the storytelling format and just a really nice climb as well.
I mean, that is really great that you even organised a rainbow at the end for your colleague.
Yeah.
I mean,
There's months in the planning just for that moment.
just that special moment at the end, because Mount Fuji is that icon, that iconic picture of Japan. I think if you ask people to think of a few things if you ask them to think about Japan, Mount Fuji would probably be in that list, along with other thing like Pokemon,
Cherry blossom,
ramen,
Sushi.
maybe sushi,
Hello Kitty. Oh, hang on, is she Japanese?
Yeah,
she is.
Yeah.
She is. Okay, cool.
But that kind of iconic image, kind of dominating the Japanese landscape, or at least kind of in and around Tokyo, and kind of, I guess, much further afield as well. But thinking about Japan more broadly, what drew you there? How did you end up doing what you're doing?
I mean, it's a very strange it's this kind of strange coincidence of factors that led me here, some of which actually involves mountain climbing. But basically, I got a language scholarship out of university, which had nothing to do with my degree. I studied geography at university, and I was, as you do when you get to the end of university, you go, shit, what's next? And one of the things my university offered was a kind of scholarship partnership with a university down in southern Japan, in a city called Fukuoka. So that's what originally brought me over here. And then while I was there, or while I was down in Fukuoka, if you've been to Japan, you'll know that it's a very, very mountainous country, which is very different to, say, London, where there are no mountains in sight. So I was in my room on that first day and looked out of the window, and I could see mountains going on for miles and miles and miles. And kind of as a joke, but, also a little bit of ambition. I was like, oh, well, in the first, 6 months I'm here, I'll try and climb every single one of those mountains. And so I found the ones that had guides written for them in English, and I climbed those first and just kind of went up them and had a few good hikes. And then after that, I started just writing guides for the ones that hadn't been written about in English, just as I did them, and started sending them to a local magazine called Fukuoka Now, which is a really good resource if you're ever in Fukuoka in southern Japan. And that turned into like a full-time freelance thing for them, regular freelance thing for them, which then turned into a full-time job for them, which turned into freelancing for the Japan Times, which turned into full-time at the Japan Times, and moving up to Tokyo at that point. And once I got there, I met another colleague who was really into podcasting at the time. This was just like after the Daily had started, and like the kind of beginning of the second wave of podcasting, I guess. And that's how Deep Dive happened, and that's why I'm here now still, I guess. Yeah. Kind of a long story, but yeah, a lot of chance and just kind of doing bits and pieces here and there, leading to something, well, hopefully more interesting things.
That's really cool. So you started off temporary, and now several years later, you're still in Japan.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing it's not just the mountains that are keeping you there.
No.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about what it is about Japan that has kept you?
Yeah. I mean, so a lot of it, I think, is based on how good I think Tokyo is as a city. And I think a lot of people, if they've never been to Tokyo, the picture you get of Tokyo is this like super urban metropolis, flashy lights, neon stuff, etc., etc. It's all about the city, right? But when I moved to Japan, that was when I had the realization that, yeah, there are these mountains. And then when I moved to Tokyo specifically, one of the things I really remember standing out was I went on the subway, and one of the signs they have, like the warning signs on the subway, is like, please don't lean your skis up against the like subway barriers, basically. I was like, hang on, is Tokyo a ski town? Because that's like suddenly the vibe I got. And I realized that the amazing thing about Tokyo is that you have a city which in its like greatest population sense has something like 38 million people. Like the center of it has about 8 to 10 million. So it's about the same size as London. So with that, you have all the amazing city life, not so much now with COVID, but like being able to go out, go to amazing restaurants, all the amazing art, the culture, etc. But then an hour away by train, you do have these mountains that I've mentioned. A couple of hours away by train, you have amazing ski resorts. And, you can get to the coast and the beach and everything else. And, within Japan itself, like, you'll know if you've been here that it stretches, right the way in the north to Hokkaido, which is basically the same latitude as Russia and very cold, to Okinawa in the south, which is the same latitude roughly as Taiwan or Hong Kong. So it's like tropical islands, and it's all within one country. So as a place to like travel and live, there's just a huge amount of variety that is just so much fun to explore.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've not been yet.
Have you guys? Yeah, I was going to ask, have you guys been here?
Not yet. I mean, Holly's got a different story, but for me, it was I tentatively booked to go this year when they had opened bookings again, and figured, well, what's the worst that can happen? Airlines are offering flexible booking. I'm a year into language learning, so I may as well try and book a trip. But then obviously, I should have been. I think I should still be there right now. In theory, in a parallel universe, I'm enjoying the cherry blossom right now.
Yeah, enjoying the cherry blossom and the thunderstorm.
Yeah, quite. But yeah, so it's on the cards, but not quite made it over there yet.
So I have been to Japan on my gap year. So I have Japanese godparents, Japanese family that my parents have known all of my life. So they were in the UK when I was born. My mum taught them English, and then they moved back to Japan. So I went over to stay with them in Tokyo, which was, I think, going somewhere like Japan and going to stay with a Japanese family, you get the full experience.
Mm. So what did you do at the time? What do you remember of how long were you here?
So I think I was here for 12 days, maybe. Always remember, I don't think I've ever been so cold as I was. It was February, and we went to see some temples, and I thought, I'll wear some little ballet flats because, I'm sick of wearing my trainers all the time. Oh my good grief. I actually cried because I thought I would never feel my feet again. It snowed, it was Arctic. Oh, so we went to stay in one of the traditional hotels by the sea. I can't remember where it was, but where they roll out your bed in the morning.
Yep.
Sit on the little cushions to have your breakfast. Always recall my breakfast was this full fish, teeth, eyes, tail. It was like looking at me. It was definitely cooked. It was definitely dead. But I remember thinking, oh, this is a Japanese experience, or this is not a British experience. Like, where's the batter?
Yeah. I mean, breakfast is, I think, especially as a traveler, I think you get used to it over time, but having like a full, very salty breakfast normally, because you have the fish, you have various pickles, etc., rice, soy sauce. Yeah, that is, I do remember struggling a lot with that at the beginning as well. And I remember when my dad first came out here, it was within a couple of months of me first moving to Japan, and we were sat over breakfast together in a similar kind of traditional inn somewhere, and kind of looking at each other, going like, "This would be a great dinner. This would be fantastic for a dinner." But as a breakfast, wouldn't mind some Cocoa Pops or just Weetabix or whatever else. Yeah,
because there is that stark contrast in many different ways, but and food is one of them, and that kind of oh gosh, can I really stomach this at 7 o'clock in the morning? Have you noticed other things as someone who's been there for a while, but you're not Japanese, you didn't grow up in that part of the world, so have you noticed other things in your time that still every now and again surprise you, or kind of go, oh, hang on a minute, that's not quite how we do it back in Blighty?
I mean, yeah, there's plenty of things. I think, as someone who grows up in England, like, especially when it comes to textures, your palate is so limited. So like, take a chicken, for example, what you end up eating most of the time is chicken breast, or like maybe you're feeling adventurous, like a bit of brown meat off the leg. But if you go to a yakitori joint here, which is one of those like a kind of barbecue skewer type places where they grill it over the charcoal, they'll take everything from you: the heart, the liver, the skin, the coccyx, and it's just a completely different textural experience. So I think that's one of the things you notice pretty quickly coming here. The other thing, I mean, the biggest difference is just the ubiquity of food. Basically, every price point, whether you're spending 500 yen, which is about £3 or so, to like 10,000 yen, about 70 quid for a meal, or up. Japanese food can get horrendously expensive. But whatever price point you go to, it is always delicious. You can always find something that is fantastic. And there's something like 100,000 restaurants in Tokyo as kind of like a conservative estimate. So just the dining culture here is much more common, like especially pre-COVID, like just the amount you can go out and have a really good meal that tastes pretty fresh, that's been lovingly handmade by someone and comes to, not more than 20 quid, including drinks. It's just something you can do very easily, and there's so much of it. So I think that's a real difference when it comes to the food. Japanese people are very proud of how good their food is, and I just don't think you can exist as a not very good restaurant here for more than about 3 days.
One of my favorite restaurants in London is a Japanese place called Tokyo Diner, which has been like shut for the entire pandemic, and they're doing some takeaway stuff now, but I'm really worried they're not going to open back up again, because again, it's really simple, honest food, but made really, really well to a very high standard, and at an accessible price point. It's in the heart of kind of theatre land, or kind of in and around Leicester Square, so it's an expensive part of town in London, but the food is great. You get the kind of the brown rice tea, as it all kind of gets thrown in, and at lunch you get miso soup as well, and it's that whole kind of experience, and the food is always good. I've never had a bad meal there.
Yeah, no, like food in Japan is one of the best things about it. I think it shows at lunchtime as well, when no one sits at their desk eating stuff. I mean, some people do, but the vast majority will go out and find somewhere nice for lunch, or will have packed a bento, so like a packed lunch type thing, from the morning, and take it with them, and like find somewhere proper to eat. And it does feel like there's a bit more respect when it comes to the time spent eating food. That this is something that you go, okay, I'm going to take a break from the day job, as busy as Japanese people are, and there's a lot of people do work very long hours, but certainly when it comes to food time, it's like a proper part of the day where you can enjoy it and take a moment to have some very, very good food.
So Oscar, I wanted to ask you, thinking a bit about food, this has led me onto it. A few months ago, Luke sent me a message and said, I've just found this TV show you might be interested in. Now, bear in mind, I'm on furlough, so, I do have some time with my life, called Terrace House. He was like,
yes,
I like it. Little did Luke know that started me off on an actual obsession.
So I would, just to intercede here at this point, I was trying to find accessible Japanese TV that I could watch and listen to help with pronunciation, and to help with just general kind of access. Also, it helps quite at times entertaining, but just my cards on the table, I was trying to language learn.
That's a common excuse.
Yeah, I know. That's and that's what I'm sticking to. That's my line, and you won't be able to change it.
I mean, I had no excuse except furlough. Honestly, I went down a very, very deep Japanese hole. So I just kept messaging Luke going, episode 25, episode 40.
Yeah, you raced ahead.
I went full steam. I mean, I cried. I had to rewatch episodes. I'm now on the 3rd season that's on Netflix. So I feel like I've picked up quite a lot of Japanese.
Yeah.
But thinking about food, I've noticed, first of all, my housemates and I just sit there going, how are they making such great looking food? I've literally just heated up some pasta from yesterday. The food looks amazing, but it's quite interesting to see how everyone gets involved there, and they make these really beautiful looking meals, and food does seem to be, I can see how it's quite important to them. But moving on from that, thoughts on Terrace House?
See, I haven't watched it that much. Actually, one of the earliest podcast episodes we did for the Japan Times was 2 of my colleagues who are absolute Terrace House fans, just trying to persuade me for about 40 minutes to watch it, and me going, I don't watch reality TV show much in the UK. I don't really see the point in watching something in Japanese, which, has been described as very slow and lacking in any kind of discernible drama, and even the kind of drama flashpoints in it tend to be very, very slow and kind of
mild.
I think, again, very diplomatic. But it is beautifully shot. I think that's one of the things. I've watched enough to understand what it is, and it's beautifully shot. Obviously, the places they go with it, and like all the food making scenes in particular are just very, very nicely done. They've obviously got someone and the Netflix budget to really kind of up the production game on it, because a lot, actually, like I think Terrace House is a bit of a rare example where a lot of Japanese TV looks horrendously low budget by comparison. If you were to watch something on NHK, which is the equivalent of BBC, you don't really see the kind of grand flagship show with like the beautiful cinematography of something like Planet Earth, or anything with David Attenborough in it. It's like a lot of it just looks like very brightly lit stuff. So when I saw Terrace House, I was kind of pleasantly surprised by how beautiful it did look, and kind of the pacing and the setting of all the shots was just something that very different from other Japanese TV I'd seen.
That's interesting, because it kind of almost feels like, Luke, I don't know if you'd agree, but it feels to me very Japanese in that it's very perfectly formed. It looks beautiful. It's not offensive at all. It very gently kind of pulls you in. I mean, I found this, one of the seasons, we literally sat through 20 episodes where nothing happened. And then suddenly the 21st episode, we had a tiny bit of drama. And my housemates and I, we were up till midnight. Like, we were hooked. So as an outsider, it feels very Japanese.
Yeah.
And I think as well, the kind of the dynamic of then seeing how the panel, the commentators interact with each other, and how they respond. Those were the real golden moments for me. Those are the bits that I am in creases, and just like, again, picking up on new words that are being used to describe situations and that kind of thing, but also just the way that they interact with one another as well. Those moments have been in stitches. But more broadly, programs like Terrace House do offer, I mean, it's reality TV, so obviously there's a gloss to it, and as you said, the cinematography is beautiful and it's all very shiny, and here's a nice like panned shot of all the trees and whatever. So there is an element of it's staged, but it does offer really interesting insight for Westerners who have had no lived experience of a culture that at times feels polar opposite to ours. Ranging from meal times right through to etiquette, to when you say hello to someone. All of these things are so vastly different. And the shows like that, I think, have really helped me gain an insight in when I haven't been able to visit the country.
Well, I think from talking to people who I know are really fans, one of the things a lot of people point out is just to the extent to which it does humanize young Japanese people in particular, and in that also biracial people, which often aren't seen on Japanese TV. But if you look at the demographics of Japan, it's something like 98.1% Japanese. I think it's 98.9% Japanese. Is just like incredibly homogenous as a society, but as it's kind of let in more immigrants, including myself, it is becoming a more multiracial culture, and there are more and more people who are of different races, are biracial, etc., etc. But that hasn't yet really appeared in kind of the mainstream TV. So I think what perhaps it is Netflix's influence as well, and kind of the more international focus, and knowing that it's going to be distributed kind of across the world rather than just to a domestic audience. I think it does do a much better job at capturing that kind of variety that Japan does offer. Coming back to the point though of like it being beautifully designed, Japan is such an interesting country when it comes to that, because the really well designed stuff is so well designed. And you will say, for example, go to a department store here and go to their like food section and see all the food packaging, and it's just glorious. Like, it's beautiful to see. But at the same time, there is so much in Japan which is so completely garish, and it's just like big neon signs, flashy block letters. And that's kind of part of the appeal as well. Like, Japan loves to advertise itself as this country of contrast. So it is really interesting seeing both sides of the coin, where you've got that kind of beautiful simplicity, which I think you see in Terrace House, of like just clean stuff. And then at the other end, you just have like the clutter, which is, if you look across Tokyo from any vantage point, is just like a visual representation of the city, basically.
That is reality. It's nice to be reminded, okay, not everything is perfect. And I've seen that in Terrace House. Like sometimes they walk down a street and I'm like, oh my giddy aunt, are you in a theme park? Or are you on a street?
But it's always struck me as well, again, someone who hasn't visited, but it almost feels like you could take back layers on a street view, or even in a kind of, like, you've got, it's almost like it's tiered. And I can kind of picture like, okay, well, here's the kind of, historical part, but then like a massive electricity pylon has been set up next to it and all the wires are above ground. So you can see all of those. And then you've got the kind of, building, post-war buildings that have been slowly but surely have evolved. And it feels like a very almost, it's like a 3D jigsaw where things have been layered over time. And I remember when I first, again, started taking an interest in Japan, reading a lot of Alex Kerr's books, and he really laments this kind of industrializing or modernizing of Japan in this way, and talks about kind of the concreting of Japan, and these great industrial projects that were just kind of created to create jobs and roads to nowhere. So it again, as an outsider, it strikes me as a country of contrasts. Is that your experience living there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, if we're talking about Alex Kerr stuff, he's written fantastically about those kind of issues, especially the concreting of Japan. And yeah, well, I mean, one thing I know about, or I think about the UK in relation to Japan, is like the focus on conservation is much, much higher in the UK. And part of the reason I think it lacks in Japan, I think there's a few different reasons. Some of it might come down to the fact that like the country gets periodically flattened by earthquakes, and so they're just used to rebuilding very quickly, or at least parts of the country very quickly. Part of it, I think, comes from like the rapid adoption of kind of Western technologies that happened first in, like, I'm not going to go too much into history, but like when the Meiji era started, basically before that, Japan had been in this self-imposed period of isolation, and then America came along and said, you got to trade with us. And basically Japan adopted all of these technologies. So there was like one mass period of adoption then. And then post World War II, when the American occupation, which lasted until I think 1952, there was this kind of like rapid adoption of so-called like Western values. And I think the speed at which that happened means that I think conservation, or like prioritizing a beautiful old temple as opposed to the new electricity pylon that goes next to it, has just kind of been completely forgotten. And so you do see it in the countryside in particular, where you have, for example, a dam that's just been built on a river that seems to have no flow anyway. And so you're going, what is this protecting? And, you've just ruined this beautiful, what would otherwise be a really beautiful part of Japan. There's a huge amount of just like concreting for no reason, in my opinion. And I mean, one of the things I experienced recently, which is quite interesting, was going up to Tohoku, which was the area affected by the 3/11 earthquake. So the massive earthquake that happened on March 11th, 2011. And there their response to the tsunami that came afterwards was just to build these giant seawalls, concrete seawalls, along the entire coastline that was affected. And, on one hand, you can say, oh, this might protect communities in the future from future tsunamis if they were to happen. But on the other hand, it makes the whole place feel like a prison. Like, you've got these walls which are 10 meters high. You're driving along them. You can't see the sea. These are coastal communities. Most of them rely on fishing, for example, and the residents there can no longer see the sea or even access the sea particularly easily. So, yeah, there is a real kind of tendency in Japan just to kind of put up new infrastructure for the sake of it. And yeah, it does create jobs, etc., but with not that much consideration for, shall we keep this looking pristine and beautiful? It's something I don't think you really see if you were to spend a week here, 2 weeks here, but you do really start to notice it if you're, begin to live a life here.
I wondered if I might just quickly go back to something else that you had mentioned, and you were talking about kind of the kind of racial diversity and the homogeneity of Japan. And I guess my question for you is, what's your experience of living as, a white British guy in Japan, and fair-haired, fair-skinned, and what has that experience been like in a country where, by and large, everyone looks and at least publicly thinks the same.
I mean, it's been fantastic, to be honest. Like I'm not, there are moments every now and then where, someone might kind of look at you with surprise and say, oh, Gaijin or whatever, a foreigner. And, just kind of bat it off, because at least, even if there's kind of some emotional aggression there towards you from that person, like it's very rare, I think, at least for like a white person living in Japan, to have any kind of physical violence. There definitely are problems especially when it comes to policing, for example, against, certain ethnic minorities here. I think if you were a Zainichi Korean that lived in Japan, you might have some more problems, and there's more of a history of that. And but yeah, for me, it's not an issue that I really spend any time dwelling on in like relation to my own status living here, really. Yeah, by and large, like Tokyo especially is kind of more and more international by the day, and I don't think 99.9% of Japanese people really care at all that that like in any kind of active, aggressive way that there are foreigners living here. And most of the interactions I've had with Japanese people are just like delightful and interesting and helpful and just fun, basically.
Just before we kind of wrap up our chat together, I'm wondering, what are you excited about for what's coming up next? There's so many things, I'm sure, always going on in kind of Japan, in Tokyo. The Olympics are coming up and everything else. But for you, what are you working on? What are you really excited about?
Sure. I mean, everything, I think when you're planning at the moment, everything's got to be given with this caveat of it depends on what happens with the virus. Like, I think the last time we spoke, Japan was doing pretty well, but now appears to be rocketing towards kind of its fourth wave, which we'll see what happens. The Olympics, yeah, might happen, might not. Don't really know. The official line is it is happening, but I think it could get cancelled again just because of coronavirus. Personally, right now, I have just started at a full-time language school, which is quite exciting, quite a different pace of life. So I'm taking a 3-month hiatus, sabbatical from work, just to focus on the Japanese and hopefully get that up to scratch a bit more. So, I can just stand on my own 2 feet a bit more while living in Japan. And then, in terms of travel, I've got a really nice trip planned for Golden Week. So Golden Week is this week every May where all the national holidays kind of align to give basically everyone in the country about a week off work. And so for that, I'm going to take the bullet train down to Hiroshima, and there's this really beautiful cycle ride called the Shimanami Kaido, which goes across from the mainland Honshu onto one of the fourth largest island, which is called Shikoku, and it goes across all these tiny little islands. Then we're going to cycle across there and then catch the ferry to Kyushu, which is kind of the southernmost island, and then cycle down there and then hopefully go surfing for a few days.
Amazing.
And so, yeah, it's not a grand long-term plan, but it's something I'm very excited for. And it's just, again, Japan is a wonderful country to explore, especially by bike. I'm going to throw that out there. If anyone wants to bring their bike, the roads are amazing. The flip side of all that infrastructure being built is that the roads are really, 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 really good.
I guess that level of geographical diversity in Japan, as you said earlier, just offers so many different opportunities. All the best for the intensive, or the kind of the more intensive language learning. I imagine there's going to be a lot of kanji practice in that, which good luck.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I wish I could say a good luck in Japanese, but I could say arigato gozaimasu.
You can say arigato gozaimasu.
Arigato gozaimasu.
Yeah, that probably, there you go, Holly, as if planned, that kind of segues us in really nicely. So thank you very much, Oscar, for joining us today.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thank you so much to Oscar for joining us today. In our show notes, we'll be sharing links to where you can find out more about some of Oscar's work, including his social media and the Deep Dive podcast. So do follow Oscar and get engaged with life in Japan. In the meantime, you can like and review. And what else can people do, Holly?
They can subscribe.
They can subscribe.
I mean, I think that's the main one we'd like right now. Thank you very much.
Yep, Holly's on her subscription drive, so do like and review and subscribe and goodness knows what else. And of course, you can find us on social media as well, on our shiny new-ish Facebook page. Holly, what's that?
Which is facebook.com/worldly wellbeing.
And then, of course, on Instagram, where I am at Locomotion Luca.
And I am at Roam Away From Home.
So in the meantime, that just leaves us to say adieu, or perhaps even sayonara for now, until you tune in for the next installment of the Worldly Wellbeing podcast next week.